Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Hiring for your small business? If you're not looking for professionals on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. That's like looking for your car keys in a fish tank. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even visit other leading job sites. So start looking in the right place. With LinkedIn, you can hire professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Wow.
Nice.
Yeah.
What you're hearing are the sounds of people everywhere putting on Bombas socks, underwear, and T-shirts made from absurdly soft materials that feel like plush clouds. Yeah, that plush. And the best part? For every item you purchase, Bombas donates another to someone facing homelessness.
Bombas. Big comfort for everyone. Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST. Code ACAST.
Hello and welcome to the Napoleonic Wars pod. Today's quite a special day for me because I'm interviewing the historian that frankly I wish I'd been. Now that might sound like high praise, but bear in mind it's coming from me, folks, so it probably means a heck of a lot less than it would coming from somebody who's actually esteemed. I am talking to Gavin Daly. He's a senior lecturer in European history at the University of Tasmania. He's the author of The British Soldier in the Peninsular War, Encounters with Spain and Portugal, 1808 to 1814, which does this kind of deep dive into soldiers' memoirs and does a fascinating job of kind of picking out the key themes across them. But recently, he authored Storm and Sack, British Sieges, Violence, and the Laws of War in the Napoleonic Era, 1799 to 1815. So we are going to go into a deep dive analysis of the British sieges, what worked, what really didn't, the murky areas, and yes, there's probably going to be some crime and punishment stuff because it's sieges, so brace yourselves for that, because hey, why break the tradition of a lifetime on this show and not squeeze in a conversation about discipline when I can? Gavin, welcome to the show. It's great to meet you. How are you doing?
I'm well, and thank you so much for having me on. Fabulous.
Absolute pleasure. The only sadness I have is that it's taken me this long to make it happen. But I suspect you may end up coming back.
It'll be worth the wait. I don't know. I can't promise, but
oh, it absolutely will. I mean, like I say, you have a habit of doing titles that I look at and think, Drat, that's the book that I wanted to write in sort of 5 years' time. So I think we're going to kind of have a lot of common ground in terms of our interests here. I've been using, there are a couple of books that have come out recently that I'm describing as important. This is one of them. But I want, for me, that's a very easy thing to say because I've got a massive interest in siege warfare. For our listeners who perhaps aren't quite so familiar, I think it's worth us just sort of pausing and thinking about where we are with our understanding with sieges, because it always feels to me like we have this sort of slight leaning towards being an apologist for some of the conduct. So, certainly prior to this in the historiography, what's your reading of the situation?
In terms of apologising for British conduct in the...
Yeah, absolutely.
Sack, yeah. Yes, well, I mean, to put it, the broad context here is that sieges is largely, the focus on sieges in the Peninsular War has largely been operational histories and great traditions of that, and much less so on what transpired after the storming. And my interest came from the previous book that I wrote on British soldiers in the Peninsular War, Encounters with Spain and Portugal, where I approached sieges through the lens of what this may reveal about attitudes and practices towards Spanish civilians. And then that opened up the broader context of plunder and atrocity. So I entered I entered the siege space, if you like, through that lens, and then tried to broaden and illuminate that aspect of the sieges that relatively little had been done, and only in recent years has there been more work done on that. And that's not something unique to the Peninsular War. That's a much broader phenomenon within the study of siege warfare generally, that there's been very little focus on sack as a subject in its own right, that there tends to be a few quotes thrown in about the horrors of the sack, and an assumption that we all know what a sack is and what happens. So the sack almost becomes a sort of timeless, recurring phenomena. And that's true up to a point, because the laws of war facilitate and legitimize that violence. But what I began to realize was that not all sacks are exactly the same, that they have their own dynamics, and not just the sacks, but the treatment of garrisons during and after the storming operation. So I became quite interested in dissecting, as you say, taking a deep dive into the anatomy, if you like, of the plunder and the violence, but also then taking a backward step to see how it is that we get to that position in the first place in terms of laws of war and rituals, and why you don't have the more conventional surrender rituals taking place with the French in the peninsula. So that was my initial approach, and then it broadened out into trying to contextualize and locate those sieges more broadly within the Napoleonic Wars, then more broadly again within the long 18th century in terms of both siege warfare and the history of sacks. And then I thought I might as well throw in India and South America as well to look at some important global context to help put what is transpiring in Spain into that broader for the broader issue around British siege warfare in South America and Montevideo, and then the sieges in India, particularly Seringapatam, and those that took place in the Maratha campaign in 1803. And so it was then about looking at as you say, that sense of shame around the British sacks, and understanding why that's there, because increasingly it became apparent to me, as it has to some other historians, that the level of violence in these sacks, the level of atrocity, is not at the scale that it has generally been seen as, and certainly not comparable to some of the worst sack atrocities in early modern European history. And so then it became a question of, why is there such an outpouring of moral outrage and a sense of shame and disgrace? And so the sort of dynamic or tension in the book ultimately was about tracing that tension between customary laws of war that gave license to this violence, but then a growing moral and sentimental and humanitarian repugnance at that very violence. So that tension lies very much at the heart of the book.
I could talk to you for about 4 hours on all of these topics. I genuinely could. As you're saying this, I'm almost thinking, do I go along with this episode and just split it into two, and we do a very long recording? But that would be deeply unfair of you on you. So I will try to restrain myself. Okay, I'm so tempted to rabbit hole, but let's stay with what we planned originally for the moment, because I think a lot of the rabbit holing will happen when we talk about specific examples. You talked there about theory, which is a lovely little segue. Thanks for setting that up for me. In terms of the theory of war and sieges, and I often feel that there's been a lot of misunderstanding here, and a lot of sort of, how do I put this sort of gently? There's been a sort of looseness with how people talk about the rules of war. There's sort of these comments seem to sort of be thrown in that, oh, well, it was okay because that's what the laws of war said, and nobody sort of actually pauses to go, well, this is the breakdown of the laws of war and the theories of war, and what you should and shouldn't be able to do with sieges. So help us out here. What do the rules and the conventions, and rules is obviously a sort of thing to put in air quotes there. What should happen when it comes to sieges?
So, firstly, these are by far the most regulated, etiquette-bound, ritualized, and rule-bound forms of conventional warfare in the early modern period. And there's an inherited set of traditions and conventions and rules of war that evolved from the classical period onwards within the Western tradition and the medieval period. And we're still very much bound by those in the 18th and early 19th centuries, notwithstanding some changes over time. But by the time we get to the 18th century, there are quite clear expectations around summoning and capitulation rituals around sieges. And there's a sense of reciprocity. There's a common understanding about these wars between belligerent European states and town governors and besieging generals. So they're all on the same page. And for our purposes here with sack, if you had not surrendered, if the governor had not surrendered, by the time it got to a practicable breach in the walls, that is a breach large enough for storming parties to enter, and it may have ended earlier because of bombardment or other strategies. But if it got to that conventional ending, that's the key threshold moment, whereby there's typically a final summons that's offered to the governor. And if the garrison, sometimes in consultation with the municipal authorities, refuses to surrender and begin to negotiate capitulation terms at that point in time, then rather dark laws of war kick in that you don't really see in any other conventional form of warfare, whereby it then becomes legitimate under customary laws of war. Whether it was morals, another matter, but it becomes legitimate under centuries-old customary laws of war to both put the garrison to the sword, to issue no quarter if you're forced to storm, and also then to sack the town, which invariably involved plunder and violence against civilians. And these laws of war were grounded in a number of traditional justifications that this was a form of vengeance on the part of the besieging force because they had incurred typically a heavy loss of life or a needless loss of life in the storming operation, which was an incredibly hazardous operation. There was then also a sort of political dimension to this as an exemplary punishment to warn other towns. So an important punitive, exemplary political dimension to it so that other towns may then surrender at the point of a practical breach or not, or beforehand. And then also the question of motivation and incentivization for troops in braving the storm. So a reward motivation. So they were very much the traditional justification for what then transpired once soldiers passed through the breaches.
Yeah, you tapped into two really important things, certainly that I bore my listeners with a lot on this show. When that culture of reward, if for the soldier, there is this assumption of being able to go out onto a battlefield and take what you can find. Now, that's one thing when you're on a battlefield littered with your enemy dead, because if you've won the battle and you occupy the field, that there's an ease to that. Obviously, when people have passed away, they aren't going to object to you taking their former possessions. But then when you put that into a siege setting where you do still have civilians in the town, where there are living people who aren't injured, they are not your enemy in the case of Britain, it becomes far more problematic. And it's very, very interesting to see how that culture isn't just, as I've said in the past, apologies folks, but it's not just amongst the rank and file. The officers share that kind of notion that I can take things. Le Mesurier offers a really interesting example. So Le Mesurier is an officer, I forget which regiment he's in. I believe you cite him in the book, actually. And he's talking about having taken some, I believe it's some plays, the transcripts of some plays, during one of the sieges, and he writes home to his family as if this is completely normal. It's very clear, although we don't have the family's response, it's very clear from his subsequent letter to his family where he's saying, you don't understand, this is just what happens, it's entirely acceptable. That there is this kind of disparity in the culture, and sort of what those back home think is okay is markedly different from what those on the front line seem to think is okay. You also talked about deterrence there, which is you framed it slightly differently, but I guess I kind of look at things a lot from a perspective of deterrence. This idea that if you do this once, it should then deter others from resisting to the point of awaiting the storming. And we'll talk more about sort of Napoleon's role within this sort of arguable change in philosophy that we see. But I'm just curious about whether or not that deterrence notion works. Are there examples prior to this period that almost sort of have this fable-like aura about them? Remember the sacking of whatever it might be. I mean, we talk a lot about Drogheda, but that's a very sort of early modern example. So I'm curious whether that memory persists and people sort of say, well, actually, no, we should surrender when the breach is practicable because we don't want a repeat of insert incident here.
And certainly Cromwell in Ireland comes up a number of times on that note, and Alba as well, the Duke of Alba in the Netherlands. It is an interesting question. I'm not sure whether there's been much research done on that aspect of. So certainly there's a collective memory with sack, and it becomes bound up with the identity of that town as in terms of victimization. But whether I can't think of any examples in the Napoleonic period where there's a clear link between a sacking, because there aren't that many sacks. Anyway, that's the other thing. The Peninsular War was very unusual in that sense in the Napoleonic Wars in terms of regular sieges. There's lots of sacking in terms of unconventional warfare and post-battle, where French armies in particular are marauding and plundering, and there's lots of that in the Spanish case. But in terms of conventional sieges and exemplary punishment, no, that's and of course in the case of Spain, that's not what's transpiring with civilians. There's no exemplary punishment aspect whatsoever. In fact, if there was to be any exemplary punishment, it would have been with the French garrisons, and there's nothing of the sort. And that is in fact something that a number of more hardline officers question. So the British sieges in the Peninsula aren't really part of that conventional sack in terms of deterrence for future towns to surrender, unless you're then going to try to encourage Spanish municipal bodies to then really put pressure on the French garrisons to force them to surrender, which was highly unlikely. So it's operating in a different way within the Peninsular War.
Let's stay with that sort of unique aspect of Peninsular War sieges, not least in terms of the scope for backlash, I guess, that can come out of an event like this. We'll talk about San Sebastian in a bit, and sort of save that for a separate thing entirely. But I guess not just in terms of consequences, but also operationally and politically, do they strike you as being markedly different from other sieges of the period? Because the counter argument, I suppose, would be that if you take India, for example, and Seringapatam, there is still a need for the British to. The plan is to stay and rule, right? Once they've defeated the Tipu Sultan, and by sacking Seringapatam, that's not great in terms of hearts and minds and long-term control. Well, certainly in the short term, there's very much a reason for the locals to be hacked off with the British on this. So Do you see kind of similarities in the conversations that happen around sackings? Is there a sense that Seringapatam is okay or it's inevitable? I mean, there's also sort of a fatalistic inevitability in some of the comments that are made about the Peninsular War sieges. But do you see that commonality, or is the way in which people talk about the Peninsular War sieges kind of unique?
In terms of in terms of the atrocities that are perpetrated by British soldiers against civilians, or the sack more generally at the expense of Spanish civilians, the focus is on, well, it's interesting. It's one, I expected to see more of a focus on the fact that these were allies and we're meant to be liberating them. That discourse is there to some extent. But what struck me more was just a discourse that these are civilians regardless, and they are innocent in terms of combatant status. And therefore, although and we can talk about this, there's a challenge to that. There are certain British narratives at both Badajoz and San Sebastian that challenge the notion of innocent civilians within those. They're politicized for various reasons, and that feeds back into various British attitudes and prejudices towards the Spanish peoples more generally. And that, but it struck me that I expected to see slightly more of the repugnance and horror on the part of British officers and British rankers in both memoirs and letters about the fact that these were allies of the British, that the British were meant to be liberating. And as I said, whilst you see some of that, there's not as much as I expected to see. There was a much stronger focus on these are civilians per se, on their civilian status, and that this growing moral, sentimental, humanitarian discourse around the fact that this is increasingly seen as illegitimate violence in these discourses, rather than the customary right to plunder and to commit atrocities against civilians. At Seringapatam, the British sources, there's always a sense of inevitability, that it's almost a natural force that's largely outside of the control of officers and commanders, that is going to happen, and the best that can be done is to manage that. And that's certainly my argument with respect to Wellington. And then you see a growing encroachment of the military justice system into the space of SAC, particularly in the Peninsular War, but you also see that in India. So there are parallels in that sense, both with India and Spain, that by the time we get to Wellington in the Maratha War in 1803 at Gawilga, for example, at that siege, he issues very clear instructions that there should not be any plunder. And I think that's part of the legacy of what he's learned from Seringapatam. As I say in the book, that seems to go missing at Cedro Rodrigo, and we're starting all over again. And there's another clear, I think, learning curve and a growing sense of the military justice system encroaching into the space of SAC in Spain too. So the Peninsular War sieges more generally, though, of course, all regular sieges share a common operation within variations. They share a common operational characteristics. They all share the same broad laws of war, at least amongst European belligerents. But certainly the sheer number of sieges that we've got, regular sieges in the peninsula, the primacy that's placed on fortresses in the peninsula, particularly Badajoz and Cedro Rodrigo, as the famous gateways to Spain, the way in which, particularly from the French, and particularly with Suchet in the east, how sieges operate in conjunction with broader pacification processes, so control of the cities, and then broader pacification processes and counterinsurgency against guerrillas. And the sheer length of the war in the peninsula, the complexity of the number of actors, the sustained brutality that you get in the peninsula for such a long period of time, that shapes the nature of the sieges to a degree there.
There are a few things that you mentioned there that that I am going to rabbit hole on. Apologies, folks, but they're just so interesting. You talked about sort of the humanity aspect, and it strikes me that this is an ongoing struggle in Spain and Portugal. This idea that no, you can't go and plunder the locals, and there are a whole raft of reasons from that. Wellington doesn't want to be on the receiving end of the counterinsurgency that the French are on the receiving end of. There's also sort of the moral element, there's the discipline element. Sometimes there's also a lack of understanding of the privations that the troops are suffering and some of the motivations for plunder. Do you think it's all part of the same conversation, or do you think that the sieges sort of end up being a focal point because everything's sort of so concentrated, so obvious, and so much more violent, and ends up being sort of that much more visible because of it?
Yes, so it is a much more concentrated microcosm, and so we can see clear links between troop behaviour within those siege environments and British troop behaviour across the peninsula more generally. As I say in the book, British attitudes towards civilians or prejudices don't end at the town walls. So if we look at plunder more generally, there are clear links, there are clear commonalities in terms of practices, but the key distinction, I would argue there, is that plunder within a siege environment is legitimised under customary laws of war, and plunder throughout the rest of the peninsula is not legitimised. It is in fact outlawed under military law. There's no customary right to plunder. And it's punishable under the Articles of War. But once we move into the siege environment, suddenly we're moving into a different space in that sense, that it's under customary laws of war, which are not identical to military law. And so that's where you get the tension. And Graham at San Sebastian, when he's corresponding with Wellington about the challenges of trying to manage it, says that I wish we had a different military law system where we could punish under prevailing military law the offenders. And so I think we're seeing a very clear tension between that in both India and Spain, and a growing encroachment with as you would know, with the provosts coming in to address the issue. But you had the customary right, and as you say, soldiers saw this as a right of theirs to take plunder and to sack the city. So it's that tension between growing humanitarianism, growing sentimental culture, a growing sense of empathy, a growing sense of understanding, feeling, and suffering. But on the other hand, that customary right to plunder a stormed town.
Just to give folks a sense of the degree of that entitlement, I believe it's William Lawrence who writes in his memoir very candidly about how he and his colleagues are actively planning basically a crime spree once they get through the breaches. So they've been in the town previously, having been quartered there in the aftermath of the Talavera campaign, which therefore means they know the lay of the land. They therefore know where the silversmiths are. And their plan is, right, person X is going to bring a candle, you're going to bring something heavy to bash down the door, and collectively this is where we're going to go, this is the plan. So they have this sense of, no, this is absolutely fine. Not only to go and mention it in a memoir afterwards, which is really interesting. And there are all kinds of interesting questions actually about the degrees to which things are or are not said. So I have theories about what Costello does and doesn't refer to that are incredibly grim in terms of the suffering of civilians. But there is this belief that, no, this is fine. You know, they can have these conversations amongst their colleagues and everyone's in on the plan. And that tells you a heck of a lot about this sense that there is this belief that that's okay. The thing that really struck me, though, was when you were talking about the encroachment of military justice into all of this, because it was Badajoz that got me into Crime and Punishment in the first place. And it was the absence of official means and judicial means, fundamentally, of dealing with the aftermath of Badajoz that really shocked me. Properly a sort of sit back and what the hell's going on here moment that you very occasionally get in the archives. But as you say, when it gets to San Sebastian, there are efforts in Badajoz, aren't there? You know, the provost are sent in famously. I've never really been able to track whether or not somebody is actually hung for it, because you have the accounts that say that that was the case, and yet that doesn't seem to quite tally up with some of the other records. But for me, it's always felt, and I wonder what your sense of this is, but it feels as though San Sebastian is about trying to learn the lessons of Badajoz. So whether that's having they have a court-martial sitting, I believe it's a drumhead court-martial that sits all the way through, and they do actually punish. They don't punish many, it's worth saying, but they do punish. Do you get that sense that San Sebastian sort of, it's the logical progression of the learning curve?
Yes, I do. And I think the controversy as well around San Sebastian allows us to scrutinize what transpired there with British measures, because that was part of the British defence in light of, you know, accusations of deliberately burning the town. But yes, absolutely, there's a much stronger vigilance, I think, over San Sebastian. Wellington is issuing clearer instructions. There are clear instructions given to the troops before the storming. You have the provost ready to go in almost immediately. There's already a sense that because of troops, and this is one of the interesting things about SAC, it's not just the troops that storm, but it's troops just coming in after the storm that were not part of the storming operation. There's a much clearer sense of sealing this off, that you're not going to have what transpired at Badajoz, where you just got regiments falling in, or later, you know, the Portuguese brigade also getting involved in what transpired. So yes, there is that, and that's despite the fact that you've got much more challenging conditions in trying to manage SAC within San Sebastian. You've got an extraordinary firestorm, and you've still got the French garrison in the citadel with artillery. So it's much more challenging to manage the SAC. But the evidence from, you know, the detailed evidence from Hayes' report and from other accounts is that this is certainly the most concerted effort on the part of the British Army to manage SAC.
There are two ways we can go.
And a lot of confiscation of plunder within the town.
I mean, that's an interesting one in itself, because obviously San Sebastian 1813, it comes in the wake of Vittoria as well. Yes. Wellington not being happy about not getting his hands on the baggage train because he wants to use the treasury to then finance the army. So, and there are accounts in the wake of Vittoria of the packs being searched and some members of the rank and file being absolutely furious. They feel like this is a breach of contract, almost, you know, a deprivation of one of their rights, that I was at the battle, I did my bit, I then took what I saw, and now you're taking that off of me. Do you think there's a direct line between the post Vittoria and what happens at San Sebastian? Is there this sort of sense of, we are now coming down hard on this idea that you perhaps might take the odd thing, you're not going to systematically scoop everything up in your arms and walk away with it? Is there this sort of culture shift that's happening finally? And equally, I have another question about whether or not Badajoz is sort of is something that catches people by surprise. Perhaps we'll save the Badajoz bit for a second question.
I think that's a really important point, Zach. That I think, and I'd like to talk that. I think Badajoz does take certainly Wellington by surprise, and the high command. It's an interesting point about Vittoria. I think there is I think there is a link. I mean, we've got classic examples throughout the whole of the war, but at say the march to La Coruña and what transpires after Talavera, and then the march back from Burgos and the retreat from Madrid. There's extraordinary circumstances around those, but at Vittoria, it's classic attacking the baggage train and the 18th Hussars being particularly singled out. So yes, I do think that's another factor in adding a greater sense of vigilance with respect to getting as much of the plunder back as possible. There are stories in some accounts. There are stories of plunder being confiscated and indeed being burnt by officers in camps outside Badajoz. I'm trying to think of which account. I'm not sure it's George Simmons, but there are some accounts where there's not much. It's just a sentence or two where there is that. And at Montevideo as well, British officers there are confiscating the relatively little amount of, because there's virtually very minimal amount of plunder at Montevideo, which really does set it apart. But there's stories there of officers confiscating the plunder. So it's in the context of the Peninsular War, yes, I think San Sebastian is the culmination. And what's interesting about that is we've got the three sieges, then the three sacks from January 1812, then Badajoz, and then finally San Sebastian. So it allows us, in a way, with the same troops, to explore those changes and continuities over time. So it's a really interesting set of case studies.
What I'm also quite struck by is that tendency to blame the civilians. And I've always wondered how much of that is just sort of a knee-jerk scapegoating exercise, partly because I do see a lot of that in the sort of the general attitude of the British rank and file. And this is one of the things that I've written about in the past, that given an opportunity, blame the Portuguese or blame the Spanish. And a lot will depend on whether or not you've seen the Portuguese fighting. A lot depends also on underlying prejudices that you've talked about in your book. But when it comes to particularly Badajoz and San Sebastian, there are these rumors that circulate that, well, part of the problem actually was the Spanish locals who just wandered into the town and took what they wanted. They were as culpable as we were. What's your reading of that?
Certainly that, in terms of Spanish civilians coming in and plundering, certainly there's some evidence of that, and that there is a plunder economy, to use John Lynn's phrase, that's operating there, and that other communities do in fact benefit to a degree from what transpires in terms of the circulation of goods, because British soldiers are holding auctions, and they're not just being bought by other soldiers. There are locals, so it is operating at that level. But I think that certainly the British they certainly emphasise that point when they can, and also that Portuguese soldiers or Spanish soldiers, or indeed French soldiers, purportedly taking them around at Badajoz to show them the best, and said Rodrigo, the best plunder spots.
We strayed a long way from what I planned to ask you, so I'm going to sort of flick back to some of the original questions that I'd planned, and just sort of talk more generally about sieges, because I am conscious that we've talked about how a lot of this is more about the sort of the emotional and the legal and moral aspects that you've written about in this book, but a lot of my listeners will also be interested in that operational side, and there is this ongoing sort of debate, and it's something that folks are writing about as we speak, in terms of Wellington and sieges, and whether or not Wellington does sieges badly. My
Mm.
personal view is that yes, is the bottom line with that. Theodore Rodrigo perhaps being the exception. But certainly when you look
Yeah,
at Badajoz, the multiple attempts to take Badajoz, part of that's about lack of resources, part of that is about
yeah.
bad planning, in my opinion. Burgos, very obvious case of a siege that goes badly. San Sebastian gets interrupted, so that's a harder one perhaps to judge. But
Mm.
there is this, you're the expert on this, you've looked at a number of sieges. Do you get the sense that it's the British in general that do sieges badly? Is it just that sieges are very hard to conduct during this period? Or is this something unique to Wellington? You know, Wellington just doesn't have an aptitude for sieges that he does in terms of the rest of his battle record.
Yeah, it's a tough one because Wellington's record is so strong in every other area. So it really does sort of, his strengths as a commander in so many other contexts, perhaps shine a more disfavourable light on his much more mediocre record with sieges. I mean, I'm not a specialist on the operational side, but certainly looking at the sieges and having looked at a lot of work on the siege operations in helping me contextualize what was transpiring. Certainly, I think Wellington is not at his best when it comes to sieges. I think that there are a number of mitigating factors, though, and environmental and circumstantial factors around that. But there's a lot of contemporary commentators, including Colonel John T. Jones himself, who doesn't overtly single out Wellington, but rather puts this within much broader historic structural limitations on British siege craft, and also the relatively limited resourcing. So the British don't, as a number of historians have highlighted in the Peninsular War, they don't enjoy the depth and breadth of the French engineering corps. They don't have trained sappers. There are problems with ordnance. All that plays out. And then when you consider the relatively vulnerable state of the British Army in the Peninsula, that one decisive defeat could be it in a conventional battle. They don't have the luxury of losing multiple battles as the French may have in the Peninsula. So the soldiers, in a way, are a much more precious commodity, even though they're going to be used in the storming operation. So there's a heightened pressure, I think, placed on Wellington as a siege commander within the Spanish environment. Time is always an enemy in sieges, but I think even more so for the British. But there were those circumstantial and structural constraints. You don't have a lot of siege experience for the generation that fights in the Peninsular War. The last time the British had been, this is not the age of Marlborough. The last time the British had fought in a land-based continental siege was at Dunkirk and Valenciennes during year 17 in the early French Revolutionary Wars. And, there are some arguments that the sort of lightning quick approach of Wellington's in India doesn't then work particularly well in the Spanish context, when you've got more formidable fortresses being defended by European garrisons with French generals. So it's a combination of factors, and it continues to be a fascinating debate with the relative service branches, of course, at the time, and having their supporters ever since about blaming with the engineers, the artillerists, the Wellington. So that operational aspect, I think, is a particularly fascinating one on the British siege. I mean, no siege is perfect. There are very few sieges that are perfect. The Clausewitzian friction always takes over the reality between the theory and the practice of war. But certainly, British sieges in the Peninsula fall short of a lot of textbook ideals. So yeah.
Is that because sieges have become so much harder in the sense that the technology and the planning of fortifications is so advanced at this point. It's almost at its pinnacle. I would argue, at least until the development of more effective means of firing over defenses. Is that part of the problem, that you're in the sort of almost the post-Vauban era, and so therefore, yes, okay, there are variations between fortifications because these are almost organic forts in that they grow over time, and you've got populations that have to live within them, and you can't build a perfect fortress on something that was originally designed as a castle and then has developed over the years. Is that part of the problem, that actually it's very hard to conduct an inverted commas good siege?
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
In terms of conducting regular sieges, and we shouldn't forget that, you know, a great class of regular sieges really hadn't been wasn't really part and parcel of European warfare since the War of the Austrian Succession, to some degree in the 7 Years' War, but there were sieges in the east, but bombardment was becoming increasingly important, and bombardment is becoming more and more important during the Napoleonic period as well. But when it came to Spanish sieges, you just couldn't blow in the gate as you did in India, or go over the walls with an 18-foot ladder. Now, Seringapatam is different, but it was the Spanish cities were much more challenging. But nevertheless, certainly since for 100 years or more, artillery had the clear ascendancy over fortifications, and it was only a matter of time generally when a besieging force, all things being equal and having the right ordnance, would breach the walls, and there would be a surrender. But of course, in Spain, you've got a tradition of popular resistance that really galvanizes resistance against the French during many of the Franco-Spanish sieges of the Peninsular War. And the British generally, by the time we get to the Peninsular War, and Jones highlights this, he argues there's a much stronger focus on bombardment. Now, that's an interesting aspect, though, of Wellington, because he does not support conventional bombardment. And that makes him unusual amongst both British commanders and French and Prussian and Russian commanders, where there's a much greater propensity and willingness to bombard towns. And sometimes that can be driven purely by circumstance, that you don't have the siege train to do that, and you need a very, very fast response, to a fast solution. But Wellington does not, to his credit, engage in bombardment.
How much of that is political necessity? Sorry, say that again.
Oh, and that may be partly because of the legacy of Copenhagen as well, that he was present there. He was against bombardment at Copenhagen. He had seen the horrors of bombardment, and certainly that, I think there's a connection there with what then transpires in the peninsula.
That was going to be part of my follow-up question, was how much of that is Copenhagen and how much of it is sort of political necessity, i.e. this idea that we've touched on already, that you're meant to be liberating these people, and if you're bombarding the town, then by definition you are targeting them, and politically that's just going to be hugely problematic.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Having said that, that didn't prevent the British from bombarding Flushing. But yes, and Wellington highlights this point that it's counterproductive, because the French garrisons will simply not surrender in the face of Spanish civilian suffering. It's not going to weigh on their moral conscience. But yes, there was an important political aspect to that as well, that the bombardment of the systematic indiscriminate bombardment of Spanish towns was politically going to cause all sorts of problems.
Next up, I want to talk about Napoleon within all of this, because we talked about sort of conventions and this idea that once there is a practicable breach, you do the sensible thing. You don't risk the bloodshed and everything that's going to bring, and therefore you agree terms. Now, for the British, there isn't perhaps an easy point of comparison, because the big British siege where the British are on the receiving end, that comes to mind is, of course, Almeida. You have the magazine going up almost within a few hours of the French starting the bombardment, and it's very obvious by that point that there's no way that they can fight on. So there isn't a choice in that surrender. Yeah. But do you think there is perhaps a cultural difference? Because Napoleon has a very different stance on all of this. He's not in favor of surrender unless at least one assault has been beaten off. And you talk about something called the cult of obstinacy. So sort of bring all of this together for us and talk us about these different ideas.
Yeah, there is the British example at Tarifa, where they withstand an assault with Spanish and British troops, and there's a huge argument within the British senior officers there, but they do stand the assault there. I mean, what struck me looking at the sieges many years ago was that there were passing references to this regulation of Napoleon's, and so I wanted to really unearth that regulation. And it comes out, I mean, there's an initial regulation in 1809, but then there's a general regulation to all governors and Carnot's treatise that supports this, that French governors could not surrender unless they had withstood at least one general breach assault. Now, there'd also been that ordinance under Louis XIV, a century earlier in 1705, but it was never put into effect. Certainly within the War of the Spanish Succession, all the sieges that Marlborough's involved in, you have French garrisons surrendering. And a number of historians have highlighted this shift in the late 17th, early 18th century, that the older resolve to defend a practicable breach is waning. Now, there are some regional differences. Interestingly, within the War of the Spanish Succession, within the Spanish theatre, you still have some famous obstinate defences at Zatifa, at Denia, at Barcelona in 1714. But generally speaking, that older sense that you would defend the breach has largely, certainly within the northern theatres of the War of the Spanish Succession, it's largely vanishing in the 18th century. But then we see it again it's revitalised with the French revolutionaries. And so it's coming out of the French Revolution, the republicanism and Jacobinism, 1792, 1794, and then finally we have Napoleon with this in 1810. And at the one hand, we've got French governors, of course, abiding by this regulation, and that there's the sense that they could be shot if they surrender without defending at least one general storm. But my going back and looking at the long-term history of this, my argument is that there's a shift over the course of the 18th century that we don't really see come to fruition until the French Revolution, Napoleonic era, because we don't get a chance to see this tested with respect to defending practical breaches. And it's based around a growing sense of we need a reinvigoration of military honor, readings of aristocratic culture, degeneracy, that we need a renewal, part of the military enlightenment. It's bound up with growing sense of patriotic self-sacrifice. And we've also got a number of jurists who, and particularly Emma Vattel in the 1750s, who he singles out that old law of putting a governor to death for defending a breach as completely unjust for someone who has just done their duty. So we can, and siege manuals over the course of the 18th century continue to have, and Vauban himself early on still had a model of defending a practical breach. So all this comes together in that French decision. And also, if we look at, and it doesn't have to be just a practical breach where you would take that level of obstinacy to extreme levels, as the siege of Danzig, which is one of the most horrendous siege experiences of the whole Napoleonic Wars. There's no practical breach there because it's not really a regular siege, but the imperial garrison there and the inhabitants of Danzig endure extraordinary circumstances for nearly a year. So yes, it's a complex multi-causal issue, I think, and I think it does transcend. It's not just a French phenomenon, although it's most articulated because it's regulated by Napoleon. But I think if we had British troops in more defensive situations, we would see a similar level of obstinacy. And I certainly think that also plays a part in why British soldiers show quarter towards French soldiers with those garrisons. But that doesn't apply when they're dealing with Spanish garrisons in Montevideo or Indian garrisons in Seringapatam and Gawilga.
On sort of cultural differences, are there different expectations on each side in India, or are they all kind of working around similar ideals? I'm just wondering if there's a cultural disconnect, and whether the British operate under one sort of way of thinking, and actually there's a very different set of ideas going on in the Indian camp.
Well, there are examples, for example, at both Seringapatam and Gawilga, of soldiers, but also civilians, because they're fearful of being executed or of a sack, of throwing themselves off the walls into canals at Seringapatam, at Gawilga as well, throwing themselves over the cliffs, and examples of civilians being killed at the hands of, well, in terms of British reports of civilians being killed at the hands of Indian soldiers to spare them the fear of being raped and murdered at the hands of British soldiers. But there's certainly much more of a cultural disconnect in the context of the sieges in India. Much greater calibration and sense of reciprocity and a common language of war with what's transpiring in the peninsula. But in India, there's much greater friction and misunderstanding there based on cultural difference.
One of the things I want to do at this point is just sort of start diving into some little bits around the three big Peninsular War sieges, and talking about specific aspects of them. One of the things that you have emphasized quite a bit in your work is sort of emotions and sensory overload, most obviously at Badajoz, because Badajoz almost feels unique in terms of the gore element. I mean, fundamentally, the main assault fails, right? And it's the secondary assaults that end up carrying through, the diversionary attacks that end up being pursued almost sort of by chance as much as anything else. And that this is what often gets mentioned, isn't it, when people talk about the sackings and the aftermath, that, well, think about what they've been through, therefore it was a given that this was going to happen. Just talk us through what you've kind of written about emotions and sensory overload, and the influence that has on what happens at Badajoz.
So yes, I do spend quite a bit of time looking at soldiers' emotions, because they're front and center really within their own accounts. These are highly emotive accounts. These are extreme emotions of war that we see being articulated by soldiers, both privately and within later published memoirs. And it's a complex play of emotions that's in place, and it does start off very much with the storms. And I use the phrase "storm of emotions" in the book. And there is a great deal of conflicted emotion with the storming operations, between a sense of excitement and adrenaline and the thrill, but also a profound sense that comes across in some writings more so than others. It's not something that that Kincaid's going to highlight, because he's much more into sort of stoic masculine forms of martial identity. But there are others where it's very clear that they are dealing with fear, and it's how they're trying to manage that fear. So extraordinary sense of fear about what is going to transpire. Now, once you've got the soldiers passing through the breaches, the conventional understanding, and this certainly is an important factor, is the cathartic nature of that experience of passing through the threshold, of both a sense of liberation, but also soldiers carrying the extraordinary trauma and fear of what they've just experienced, and of surviving, but also seeing so many of their comrades slaughtered in the breaches. But that sense of cathartic release and venting, and a sense of rage, a sense of vengeance, being very much there. Having said that, what I also argue in the book is that focus on a cathartic release, whilst it's important in understanding some of the violence of the sack and the plunder, that it only takes us so far. Because if we look at the sacks in more detail, there's a control and management of that emotion as well. For a start, there's not indiscriminate violence. French soldiers, for example, are not set upon. And that's a consistent pattern. Whatever we argue about the sort of operational slight differences between the various three sieges, there's a broadly consistent pattern there. There is some suggestion that some French soldiers are killed in the castle at Badajoz, but that's an extraordinary situation in terms of the confined nature of the space. But you don't have a systematic withdrawal of quarter during the fighting or immediately after at any of those sieges. But you do have an emotional release being vented against Spanish civilians. So there's a clear application of that violence about who's spared and who's not, restraint in some important spheres and a lack of restraint in others. There's also the fact that the sacks last 2 or 3 days. It's not just one huge emotive explosion. That has to dissipate in time. And you've also got soldiers that aren't involved in the storms also later participating in the sacks. So when you've got a sack that's going for 2 or 3 days, that hot-blooded, emotional, transformative notion of an out-of-body experience early on, that only gets you so far. And you begin to look more at rational instrumental behaviour and practices within the sacks. And I've talked about the sort of highly ritualized nature of plunder sacks that that starts from, you mentioned Lawrence and the planning about what shops they're going to target. That's got nothing to do with their emotional response of coming through the breaches. It's clearly calculated beforehand. So too that there may be some payback against former hosts in Badajoz who were not particularly hospitable. So there's a calculated, rational application of violence that's being planned even before the sieges, the storms commence. And I guess the other thing about the emotional aspect of the storms and how they play out in soldiers' accounts is it's not just the darker emotions of war, as some historians have coined the phrase, but within those very same accounts, we also find amongst British soldiers a sense of compassion, a sense of empathy, a sense of shame, a sense of humanity that coexists alongside the violence that's being and plunder that's being perpetrated. So it's a highly volatile emotional space. It's a highly complex emotional space that I think highlights the tension between that customary right to sack a town and a growing sentimental moral concerns, and also soldiers very much in this period in the late 18th, early 19th century, being very much influenced by sentimental culture, including rank and file. Wildly conflicting emotions that I think highlights, that really captures in a sense the emotional truth about the sacks themselves, that they're caught between the old customary laws of war and older traditions and a growing moral humanitarian sensibility, that horror. I mean, we shouldn't forget the emotion of horror here, the horrific reactions to the sights and sounds that they are experiencing and witnessing, the focus on the witness, the soldier as witness here, and atrocities perpetrated by one's own.
You touched on something there which it has always been really striking, and it's sort of the great disconnect, and you framed it really nicely there in terms of there's, as you say, it's not the French who end up taking the brunt of this, it's the civilians, the Spanish civilians, the Allies fundamentally. And it goes back to something that we were talking about earlier in the xenophobia that I see a huge amount of in soldiers' memoirs. Do you think that is part of what plays into this sense that the French are seen as almost an inverted commas honourable enemy and honourable people? Culturally, they're seen as more similar to the British, which in turn is ironic because the developments of nationalism, national identity are starting to crystallise around this idea, well, we're not French, that's how we're going to define ourselves. Just, read your Linda Colley. But for the Spanish, there is this sort of, and the Portuguese, the comments that are made are, these are backward people, these are dirty, they're lazy. Is that part of what's going on here, that, well, the French soldier doing their job as, somebody who I can culturally identify with is an individual that I'm not inclined to go and bayonet at will, whereas the Spanish civilian trying to defend their house, well, I've got no interest in you, you're sort of, I consider you to be culturally inferior to me. Is that part of what you think might be playing into this, those sort of deep set prejudices that then bubble to the fore at times like this?
Yes, I certainly think that's a factor that lowers the level of restraint on the part of British soldiers towards the civilians that they're confronting, and so that's part of the broader experience of British soldiers in the Peninsula, where there's a sort of enlightened conceit that they are culturally, politically, economically, and socially superior to the Portuguese in particular, but also the Spanish. And there's a sort of patronising approach to the Portuguese, almost as if they're sepoys that are being deployed with the British, that they're being trained by the British, that the British will instill martial courage and heroism and instill discipline within Portuguese soldiers. I certainly think that plays out. Religious prejudice, certainly amongst Protestant soldiers within the British Army against Catholic Spanish and Portuguese, and also a sense, particularly with the Spanish, that when soldiers get into Spain, there's a sense of disillusionment. Where are these patriotic Spaniards that have appeared in the press at home, that we've heard about at Saragossa and elsewhere? Where are these patriotic Spaniards in terms of the Talavera campaign? And I think that plays out certainly with Badajoz. So there's that sense of are these people worthy of our own sacrifices? And of course that then is even, so there's always that British soldiers, but I think that's even doubly so given the sacrifice in the storming operation. So I think that can play out there as well. But yes, I think the general level of prejudice and general lack of respect for the Spanish peoples, notwithstanding romanticization and the exoticization of the Spanish and positive affirmation of certain qualities, but overall, generally, a rather negative and critical portrayal and stereotyping of the Spanish inhabitants. I think that does not necessarily dehumanize, but certainly lowers the threshold level for violence and plunder in British soldiers' eyes with respect to Spanish civilians.
At this point, I'm going to be a really bad podcast host and double back to some themes that you've been raising over the course of this and just sort of tease out some follow-up questions because they are so interesting. And I don't think my listeners will forgive me if I don't do a thorough job on this. You talked about how, in some respects, the aftermath of sieges has been ever so slightly sort of overstated. There is this sort of tendency to almost elevate these aftermaths to being head and shoulders above anything else that happens in siegecraft during this period. And an example of this was put to me very, very early in my PhD process, where somebody was a well-respected historian had mentioned the figure of 4,000 individuals being slaughtered, 4,000 civilians being slaughtered at Badajoz. And that figure is, I'm sorry to say, just plain wrong. I don't know where the original sources for that came from, but if you look at the diocesan archives in Badajoz, there are a long way short of 4,000 people in the town at the point at which the British start the encirclement process, and then some leave beyond that. So there's no way that happened. Do you think, and this is a dangerous question because neither of us are trying to trivialize what happened in these sieges, and let's be clear on that, and neither are apologizing for that and saying that it was okay. But do you think that the scale of this has been overstated? And what do you think might be the reasons for that, if that is the case?
I think it has been overstated. And I think there's a number of factors we could highlight there. One, the sense that sacks are always similar, in that you've got mass indiscriminate atrocities committed when sacks do take place. And of course, at both Badajoz and San Sebastian, you've got sacks that go for two or 3 days. Particularly with San Sebastian, you have all the polemics around San Sebastian and different narratives from the British and Spanish perspectives. But British memoirs themselves and British letters at the time play into this, with a sense of sensory overload that no one's quite sure just how many. There's a sense of universal horror, of universal slaughter. I mean, no one ever comes up with a figure. I think Tompkinson has a figure for I think he's the only one I can remember, a contemporary soldier who actually comes up with a figure. But how the figures are arrived at is often very difficult. It's very difficult to trace the genealogy of those figures, and often they can then be repeated, but not examined. And certainly, as you say, the dicey archives in Badajoz certainly don't indicate that number of deaths. And it's always very difficult, particularly in sieges where there's a storming operation. You don't know. It's very difficult to get clear figures on the number of inhabitants in the town to begin with, let alone those who were there at the storming operation. And with something like San Sebastian in particular, it is extremely difficult to then try and to distinguish amongst the different sources of fatality with civilians, in terms of the fires, bombardment, the actions coming during the storming operation itself. But certainly, I think some soldiers, in terms of Gothic writing, in terms of what the multiple motives they have around writing about the sieges particular ways, they're often, for example, you've got these hyperbolic statements around this is the worst sack since Jerusalem, or using biblical language, the case of Herod and the massacre of the innocents. Shawman famously talking about San Sebastian as being worse. What transpires at San Sebastian is an absolute tragedy. But the sack itself, in terms of the loss of life, is certainly not comparable to what transpires at Magdeburg, notwithstanding the violence and notwithstanding the extraordinary suffering that Spanish civilians endure at the hands of British soldiers. There's another side to those sacks that also highlights a growing moral and humanitarian revulsion about those practices within the very army responsible for those atrocities.
How much of that is also informed? Actually, sorry, before I ask that, I'm just going to give folks some details on the figures, because I know people will just ask me about this afterwards. So the diocesan archives indicate, and what happened was a priest physically went round providing street, house number, and names of victims. They're not comprehensive because Santo Domingo parish in the west of Bad Hof isn't included in these details, but he totals up 102 dead, 23 mortally wounded, and 83 seriously injured. So that's probably talking about a civilian casualty rate of something in the region of 16%. Still awful, but a hell of a long way from the 4,000 that others have bandied around previously. But I'm curious about, within this revulsion, how much of an awareness is there of what we now think of as sort of the classic scenes out of Goya's Horrors of War? That the British have seen French atrocity as they've moved through Portugal in the wake of Massena's retreat in 1811, and there's very obvious revulsion at that. And it's very easy for the British to create a sort of cozy little picture of themselves as liberators of Portugal, liberators of Spain. We are, inverted commas, the good guys in this conflict. We'd never debase ourselves to do something so cruel. And yet, come Ciudad Rodrigo, particularly Badajoz, actually they're slapped in the face with an indication that actually, no, you're just as culpable and capable of these kinds of crimes. How much of that do you think plays into what we see in the memoirs particularly?
I think it's enormously significant. I mean, it's often the idea of desensitization as a crucial aspect of what transpires within those towns. But what I also see, certainly within written accounts, is a continued sensitivity and a sense that, first and foremost, these are atrocities perpetrated by our own. And that's a very different framework, because until then, soldiers, yes, they'd seen plunder on their own and they actively participated in plunder, but the atrocities they'd always seen relatively from a distance as being perpetrated by the French. They were often there after the fact. They came upon the bodies, they saw the mutilation, but it was by the French. Then once they get into once we get to Badajoz and San Sebastian, they are atrocities being committed by one's own. So that adds an added dimension to the sense of horror and repugnance, and fundamentally a sense of shame and disgrace, a sense of shame that is there, is articulated at the time, that sense of disgrace and shame by a number of officers, and certainly it's articulated in memoirs rankers after the war.
Gavin, you've been brilliant and very patient with all of my sort of awkward and needly little questions the whole way through this.
Oh, no,
I've loved it.
Great questions.
I just have one final question, and it's as I wrote it, I thought that's a horrendous question to put to anybody, but it is one that fascinates me, and it ties into what we've been talking about. You know, these ideas of xenophobia, of revulsion, of are we better than the French and all the rest of it. And this is speculative, of course it is, but in a hypothetical scenario where the British end up having to besiege a French town, you know, let's say that Toulouse has fortifications, for example, and the British do end up prosecuting a siege and storming it. Do you think things would have been different? And if so, what's your sense of why they might have been different? Is that a result of the progression that we see through to San Sebastian, of a more thorough series of measures to control discipline amongst the troops to prevent this kind of thing, or would kind of cultural differences, or rather sort of perceived cultural similarities, have played a role? Because equally the French are, inverted commas, the enemy, and yet it's very striking that the British seem to have generally been fairly well behaved in France. There are exceptions, of course there are, but generally speaking, Wellington's measures from various avenues seem to sort of coalesce when it comes to the invasion of France to keep a lid on sort of the discipline problem.
Yes, yeah. I think you've touched on it all wonderfully well there, Zach. I think the conclusions from my book, and it's a wonderful speculative question, it's one that I have thought about, and the conclusions of my book would be, all things being equal operationally, that there would be less violence against French civilians. There would be violence, but I would argue there'd be less violence precisely because of those factors. That there's a sense of affinity with French civilians. There may well, as a consequence of being even stronger, focus on the orders from the outset, through the storming operation and its aftermath. But there still would have been violence. I mean, Graham, in his correspondence with Wellington about the challenges of managing SAC, or the inevitability of SAC, argued that if hypothetically the French had taken Dover and we had to take that in a siege, British soldiers would still have plundered Dover. Now, whether they were committed, and there would have probably been a little bit of violence, but it certainly would have been less than if they'd been against a French town. I mean, another interesting thing about that too is, in a way, I think the fact that you had the Spanish particularly in Badajoz and San Sebastian, being read as somehow collaborators, that they had compromised in some British discourses. You're simply not going to get that with the French civilian population, with the French garrison. But it's an interesting question. Thankfully, it never happened. But my conclusions would be the cultural, and the far greater othering of Spanish civilians is a factor there, and I think there are higher thresholds of restraint with respect to French civilians, all things being equal operationally, than what you get with Spanish civilians in held town in Spain.
Gavin, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Folks, there are 2 books that you need to go and buy. The British soldier in the Peninsular War encounters with Spain and Portugal 1808 to 1814. I suspect we might sit down and have a follow-up chat about that, because there's so much to talk about there.
Yes.
But equally, the one we've been talking about today, Storm and Sack, British Sieges, Violence and the Laws of War in the Napoleonic Era, 1799 to 1815. That one's from Cambridge University Press. The British Soldier in the Peninsular War is with Palgrave. I will put links in the description. Are you on social media, Gavin, so that people can get in touch, or do you tend to stay away from the Viper's Nest of Twitter?
I can be reached through University of Tasmania. My email address through there.
Okay, so folks, if you've got any questions, the University of Tasmania website will help you out. Gavin, I've loved it. I've just had the opportunity to spend an hour and a half nerding out about stuff that I utterly adore. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks so much, Zach.
Folks, if you're new here, remember to hit the subscribe button so that you can find your way back. If you're a fan of the period, did you know that you can immerse yourself in a Napoleonic Wars pod universe full of exclusive bonus episodes, a Discord server to chat with the wider Napoleonic enthusiast community? They're a fun bunch, trust me. Plus there are socials, the chance to request episodes, and even a course on the period. Head over to patreon.com, the link's in the description, to find out more. Much love to all my Patreon supporters. Bear in mind that if you want to enjoy the perks of a specific tier, like joining the course, but don't fancy others within a particular tier, you can now edit your pledge to secure individual perks rather than a whole package. Drop me a message via Patreon or Twitter for more details. Shout outs to my mentioned in Dispatches patrons: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, John Haynes, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Alexandra Leon, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Ed Koss, Indiana Fats, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meeking, Mark Anscombe, Bruins Girl, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Rachel Stark, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbow, Andrew Wright, Graham Spicer, Keys Bishop, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, Sam Gurman, Marcus Cribb, Robin Brasher, Hospitaler, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Roger O'Donnell, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, David Malinsky, Stephen Gillen, Richard Anderson, Andrew McCall, Arthur Forgy, and the inimitably named Reto the Sci-Fi Fan. The Admirals, that's David Preece, Rob Coughlin, Graham Callister, Mark Duckers, Michael Guest, John Haynes, Kate Walcombe, and Steve Carter. The Marshalls, that's Ger Brown, Rory Muir, Bob Burnham, Matt Bone, Colin Zimmerman, Ryan Diamond, Stephen Ashworth, and Sean Sullivan. The Emperors, Graham Swidenbank and J.C. Kaiser. And the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood, David Maxwell, Liam Telfer, and Todd and Laird Campbell. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe. And as always, thank you for listening.